At my cousin's wedding, Stephanie announced to everyone, "There is no husband, and Natalie is just desperate to seem successful like the rest of us," as I served drinks. That's when 3 black SUVs pulled up outside. The words hit me like a physical slap across the face. I stood there frozen, holding a tray of champagne glasses while every guest at the reception turned to stare at me. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim as my face burned with humiliation, and I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes judging me, pitying me, or worse, agreeing with Stephanie's cruel assessment. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it over the classical quartet playing in the corner. For a moment, I felt like that awkward teenager again, desperately seeking approval from family members who saw me as nothing more than a disappointment. The familiar shame washed over me, the same feeling I'd carried for years as the family failure, the college dropout who couldn't make anything of herself. But then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was seeing Uncle Robert's smug grin, or watching Jennifer nod in agreement with her sister's vicious words, or noticing how my own mother looked away in embarrassment. Whatever it was, the shame transformed into something cold and calculating. These people had no idea who they were dealing with. I set the champagne tray down on the nearest table with deliberate precision, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My phone buzzed in my pocket, another text from Alexander. "Landing in 15 minutes. Security team is en route." Perfect timing. I took a deep breath and allowed myself a small smile. They wanted to publicly humiliate me? They were about to learn exactly what kind of mistake that was. What my family didn't understand was that I'd spent the last 3 years building something they couldn't even comprehend. While they saw me working catering jobs and serving tables, assuming I was barely scraping by, I'd actually been developing the most successful luxury event planning business on the East Coast. Montgomery Elite Events wasn't just some small operation. We coordinated weddings, corporate galas, and private parties for Fortune 500 CEOs, tech billionaires, and Hollywood A-listers. The various jobs they mocked me for weren't desperate attempts to pay rent. They were strategic networking opportunities and hands-on research for my business. Every wedding I served at, every corporate event I helped coordinate, I was studying the industry from the ground up, learning what clients really wanted, and building relationships with the best vendors in the business. While my cousin sat in cubicles pushing papers, I was creating a company that generated over $2 million in revenue last year alone. My personal net worth had hit $1 million 18 months ago. The small apartment they pitied me for living in, that was my choice. I owned 3 properties, including a penthouse in Manhattan that Alexander and I used as our primary residence. The beat-up car I drove to family gatherings was deliberate camouflage. Our actual vehicles included a Tesla Model S, a BMW X7, and Alexander's Porsche 911. But the real game changer was my marriage to Alexander Montgomery, heir to Montgomery Industries, a multinational conglomerate worth $4 billion. We'd met when his company hired Montgomery Elite Events to coordinate their annual shareholder gala. What started as a professional relationship had evolved into genuine love, then marriage 8 months ago in a private ceremony in Tuscany that cost more than most people's houses. Alexander wasn't just wealthy. He was brilliant, strategic, and utterly devoted to protecting the people he loved. As the soon-to-be CEO of Montgomery Industries, he had resources and connections that made him one of the most powerful men under 35 in North America. More importantly, he had a very dim view of people who tried to hurt his wife. The reason I'd never brought Alexander to family gatherings wasn't shame or secrecy. It was protection. I'd seen how my family treated anyone they perceived as successful, either fawning over them desperately or finding ways to tear them down out of jealousy. I wanted to shield Alexander from their toxicity, and honestly, I've been hoping they might eventually develop enough maturity to deserve meeting him. Tonight had proven that hope was naive. My phone contained text threads with wedding planners who coordinated royal weddings, restaurant owners who served celebrities, and hotel managers who'd literally rearrange their entire VIP floor if Alexander called personally. The Grand Meridian Hotel, where Jennifer's wedding was being held. Alexander's company had acquired a controlling stake in the Meridian chain 6 months ago. The staff who'd been treating me like hired help were technically Alexander's employees. I also had something my family lacked entirely: detailed intelligence about their actual financial situations. Through my industry connections, I knew exactly how much Jennifer had spent on this wedding: $87,000, mostly funded by credit cards. What Stephanie's real salary was at her law firm, she'd exaggerated by about 40%. And which of my cousins were actually struggling financially despite their polished exteriors. The strategic advantage was overwhelming, and they just handed me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate it. I'd been planning for a moment like this, though I'd hoped it would never come. Over the past year, as family gatherings became increasingly toxic, I'd been quietly documenting everything. Every snide comment, every deliberate exclusion, every time they'd treated me as less than. I had recordings, text screenshots, and detailed notes about their behavior patterns. My first call was to David Kellerman, my business attorney and longtime friend. David specialized in defamation cases and had been urging me to take legal action against my family's treatment for months. Natalie. Public humiliation of a business owner by false statements about their success and marital status? That's textbook defamation with quantifiable damages to your professional reputation. We could file papers tomorrow. Next, I contacted Elena Foster, the most sought-after publicist in luxury events. Elena had been trying to convince me to raise my public profile for years, arguing that my story, successful female entrepreneur married to business royalty, would be PR gold. "I can have journalists here in 30 minutes, she said when I explained the situation. "Your family wants to make public statements about your success? Let's make sure those statements get the attention they deserve." The final call was to Marcus Bloomberg, Montgomery Industries head of security. Marcus was former Secret Service, and his team handled everything from corporate espionage to protecting Alexander during high-profile business negotiations. Mr. Montgomery briefed me on the situation. "We're implementing Protocol 7, full protective detail with corporate representation. ETA 8 minutes. Protocol 7 was something Alexander had developed after witnessing how certain business associates tried to manipulate him through family relationships. It involved a coordinated response designed to definitively establish boundaries with people who attempted social or emotional manipulation. I'd never expected to use it against my own family, but here we were. I also texted my assistant, Rebecca, who was monitoring my business phone during the weekend. Prepare the Kingston portfolio presentation and the Weatherby contract summaries. I may need them tonight. If my family wanted to question my success, I'd show them exactly what success looked like. The beauty of the situation was its perfect timing. Alexander's arrival would coincide with the reception's peak moment, right after dinner, when everyone was relaxed and social media photos were being taken. Maximum audience, maximum impact, and maximum validation of everything they'd just spent the evening denying. I straightened my black serving dress and picked up my champagne tray again. Time to let them dig their hole a little deeper before showing them exactly who they'd been underestimating. The first sign of what was coming happened 10 minutes later. James Harrison, the hotel's general manager, approached me during the salad course with obvious confusion. "Excuse me, Mrs. Montgomery? I received word that your husband's security detail is arriving shortly. Should I prepare the Meridian suite for a private meeting?" Stephanie, who was sitting close enough to overhear, burst into laughter. "Look, now she's got hotel staff pretending she's important. Mrs. Montgomery, that's rich." She turned to the other guests at her table. "Natalie's really committed to this fantasy. Next, she'll claim she owns the hotel." What Stephanie didn't notice was James's face going pale. As the general manager, he'd received the corporate memo about the Montgomery acquisition. He knew exactly who Alexander Montgomery was, and more importantly, who I was. "I apologize for any confusion, Mrs. Montgomery. We'll handle everything discreetly." The second sign came when hotel security quietly began repositioning themselves around the ballroom, not obvious to most guests, but clear enough to anyone paying attention that something significant was about to happen. Uncle Robert noticed first, his business background helping him recognize corporate security deployment. "Jennifer, did you hire extra security for some reason?" he asked quietly during the main course. "No, why would I need security at a family wedding?" Jennifer replied, but I could see her starting to look nervous as she noticed the suited men positioned at strategic points around the room. My phone buzzed constantly with updates. "Arriving in 2 minutes. Perimeter secured. Media contacts standing by. Legal documentation ready for immediate filing." The final sign was when Alexander's lead security coordinator, a tall woman named Victoria Blake, entered the ballroom and made direct eye contact with me. She nodded once, the signal that everything was in position. Alexander would be making his entrance in 60 seconds. I untied my serving apron and folded it neatly, then placed it on the gift table next to Jennifer's elaborate card display. Several family members watched this with confusion, but no one said anything. They were about to understand why. Alexander Montgomery walked through the ballroom entrance at exactly, and the entire energy of the room shifted instantly. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and he moved with the kind of quiet confidence that came from growing up in boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. He was followed by 3 members of his security detail, all of them discreet but clearly professional. Behind them came David Kellerman, my attorney carrying a leather portfolio. The final person through the door was Elena Foster, who immediately began taking photos and notes for what I knew would become a very strategic media narrative. Every conversation in the ballroom stopped. Even the classical quartet paused mid-song. Alexander's eyes found mine across the crowded room, and his face lit up with genuine warmth. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, crossing the dance floor with purposeful strides. The crowd parted automatically, sensing they were witnessing something significant. He kissed me softly, then wrapped his arm around my waist like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Sorry I'm late, darling. The Singapore meeting ran longer than expected, but I couldn't miss celebrating with your family." The silence was deafening. I could see Stephanie's face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. Jennifer's mouth was hanging open. Uncle Robert had gone completely pale. Alexander turned to James Harrison, who had hurried over immediately. "James, excellent work on the acquisition transition. Please comp tonight's entire event as our wedding gift to the happy couple." "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. Right away, sir." That's when the pieces started clicking for my family. The respectful staff behavior, the security detail, the fact that Alexander clearly had authority over the hotel's operations, the way other guests were starting to whisper and pull out their phones to discreetly photograph us. Stephanie was the first to attempt damage control. "We had no idea," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Natalie never told us she was married to... we didn't know." I looked at her calmly, feeling completely serene for the first time all evening. "That's because you never bothered to ask. You were too busy making assumptions and announcing them to rooms full of people." Alexander studied the faces around us, and I could see him rapidly assessing the situation. His business instincts were razor sharp, and it was obvious he understood exactly what had been happening before his arrival. "I hope my wife hasn't been working too hard tonight," he said with a pointed look at my discarded apron. His tone remained polite, but there was steel underneath it. David Kellerman approached and quietly handed me the portfolio. "Everything you requested, plus a few additional options we discussed. Elena Foster was discreetly interviewing some of the guests, gathering quotes and background information for what I knew would become a carefully crafted story about successful entrepreneurs and the family members who underestimate them. For the next hour, I watched my family's entire social dynamic crumble and rebuild around a new reality. People who had been treating me like hired help were suddenly desperate to talk to me, to ask about my business, to get closer to Alexander's obvious wealth and influence. Some of the apologies seemed genuine. My cousin Mike, who had always been kind to me, pulled me aside privately. "Natalie, I'm so sorry about how they were treating you tonight. I had no idea about your success, and honestly, even if I had known, their behavior was inexcusable. I hope you can forgive some of us." Others were transparently opportunistic. Stephanie spent 20 minutes trying to network with Alexander about business opportunities for her law firm. Uncle Robert launched into a detailed pitch about investment opportunities in his construction company. Jennifer suddenly wanted to plan a proper reception to celebrate our marriage, with herself as the coordinator. But the damage was already done, and I had documented everything. More importantly, I had learned something crucial about myself. I no longer cared about their approval. Watching them scramble to reinvent our relationships based on Alexander's wealth and my professional success showed me exactly how shallow their affections had always been. Alexander and I stayed for another hour, graciously accepting belated congratulations and deflecting networking attempts. When we finally left, it was in the lead SUV of a 3-vehicle convoy, with Elena Foster already working on the media narrative that would ensure this story reached exactly the right audiences in my industry. 3 months later, the consequences of that evening had reshaped my entire family dynamic permanently. Stephanie discovered that her very public humiliation of a successful business owner had been documented and shared widely within legal circles, damaging her professional reputation significantly. Several potential clients had withdrawn from her firm after the story circulated, and she'd been quietly passed over for the partnership track she'd been bragging about. Jennifer's marriage was struggling under the financial pressure of the massive wedding debt, made worse by their realization that they'd rejected a connection to Montgomery Industries that could have solved their problems permanently. Uncle Robert's construction company had filed for bankruptcy after a series of bad investments that might have been avoidable with access to the kind of business intelligence Alexander routinely provided to family members he respected. My parents had finally realized the magnitude of their misjudgment and spent months trying to rebuild our relationship. They'd started attending family counseling to understand how their favoritism toward my more traditionally successful cousins had damaged our family bonds, and they were making genuine efforts to know Alexander and understand our life together. As for me, Montgomery elite events had grown by 40%. Partially due to the positive media attention from Elena's carefully crafted story about entrepreneurship and family dynamics. Alexander and I had purchased a second property in the Hamptons, and I'd been invited to speak at 3 industry conferences about building successful luxury service businesses. We were planning our own celebration party for friends and family members who had actually supported us, a much smaller, more meaningful guest list. The most satisfying outcome was that I'd learned to trust my own judgment about who deserved access to my success and happiness. The people who'd valued me during my struggling years remained close friends and trusted advisors. The ones who'd only shown interest after discovering my husband's wealth had been politely, but definitively, excluded from our real life. My family had spent years assuming I was desperate for their approval and recognition. Instead, they'd taught me that the opinions of people who judge you without knowledge aren't worth pursuing. Real success isn't about proving doubters wrong. It's about building a life so fulfilling that their validation becomes irrelevant.